not only of Israel, but you're also a critic of Judaism. Now, to be a social critic, as Michael Walzer writes, you could only be a social critic from the inside. Critics from the outside are ignored. You stand up as a loyal citizen of Israel, as someone who looks Judaism in the eye and respects it, and looks Jews and says, is this who you want to be? Is this who you are? Is this worthy of you? That type of criticism, I wish 72 years after the founding of the State of Israel, that there are certain types of discussions that we should be beyond already. And that we would have a consensus as to what are the core ideologies that we want to use to found the Jewishness of this State of Israel. And what are those ideologies that we realize we have to reinterpret? Because, yeah, please, yes, Mohammad.
You're reminding me of the discussion we had, I don't know in which corner of the Hartman Center, but in that discussion, just following up on what you said, I remember saying that I do want to believe that Judaism and democracy, Judaism and equality, Judaism can learn how to treat people as equal. Jews and the State of Israel, but Jews know how to run a state based on the principles of equality. Now, convince me.
I can't convince you because the proof is going to be in reality. See, Shakespeare speaks about how the devil quotes scripture. The devil doesn't misquote scripture. The devil quotes scripture. Now, could Judaism be antithetical to democracy and equality? Absolutely. So too could Islam and Christianity. Monotheism has underachieved for over 2,000 years, has underachieved. And one of the great failures of monotheism is the notion of chosenness. The idea that if there's one God, there's one people whom that one God loves best. That is the original sin of monotheism. That's its core original sin. See, sometimes I think that idolatry, we would have been, I apologize if I'm insulting the Muslim in you because shirk is the worst thing possible, but it could be that idolatry was much better because each one has their own God, that inherent jealousness is absent. One God activated a disease in humankind. We want to love that. I don't only want to love that God, I want that God to love me best. Now, that idea undermines the core nature of our ability to live with democracy. Now, what has happened? When Jews live outside of Israel, they know that chosenness is not a way to make friends and influence people. If you walk around as a minority, powerless people and speak about your own inherent superiority and how God loves you best, you're inviting a pogrom. You're inviting a pogrom. So Jews outside of Israel have learned to reinterpret the ideas of chosenness. Chosenness begins to speak about it's a feature of responsibility. It's not a feature. It's something that you have to earn. It's not a gift that you receive. So there's all these moves that Jews outside of Israel have learned to make. All these moves. But when you have someone outside who you're worried, what are they going to think about you? But here, the reality is that in Israel, we're living in the largest Jewish ghetto in Jewish history. We have narratives that we're surrounded by people who hate us. I don't care what Hezbollah thinks about me. What do I care what Hezbollah thinks about me? Does Hamas think they're not my moral, they're not you, they're not my social critics. Not only are they outsiders, they're morally flawed. So here it is, I have power. I don't have somebody else who is my critic. And that's one of the great, interesting possible roles of Israeli Arab Palestinians within Israel. people who are firmly a part of Israel putting up a mirror. The only problem is we're more powerful than you. And as a result, we could ignore you. We'll invite you, we hear you, we'll even give you an award from time to time, but then we go back and we go to sleep just fine. So you ask me, could Judaism live with democracy? Maybe, if we work at it. Just like Islam and just like we have to work on it. And one of the key features that we have to reject is this notion of chosenness. Because what is it like? You know better than anybody. What is it like to live in a country in which 80% of the people feel essentially that they're the chosen people? So what does it make you?
Well, Donniel,
if God loves me more than God loves you, why should I love you? So you ask, could Judaism convince you? It's not about convincing. I have to do work. My community is not ready yet. I have to do a tremendous amount of work to earn your respect and to earn your confidence. And I haven't done that yet.
Well, Donniel, I think that, when I think about Jewishness and Judaism, I'm not sure if it's Judaism because I'm not looking at it from the religious aspect, but more about Jewishness, meaning about the state of mind of Jews that I interact with, the feeling that is surrounding me around the country. I have basically two angles to it. One angle is it reminds me of the roots of my Islam. I mean, for me, when I look at Jewishness, or even Judaism, let's put the term Judaism, it doesn't feel strange to me. So I have a problem even looking at it as an enemy identity, because I see my Islamic identity as an extension, let's call it 3G, the third generation of Jewishness, an evolution of Judaism. If you go to more radical Muslims, they would say a replacement. But in my perspective, I see it as an evolution, and I don't relate to it as something strange or foreign. And when I look at the core values, I connect with them very well. And I also know the stories that Jews describe to themselves that they are the chosen people. Those are stories and beliefs that I've read them and I've seen them, and actually I did learn to respect them. I have no problem with you feeling that you're the chosen one by God, as long as you allow me to feel I'm the chosen one by God.
We have no, again, you see, we could hold hands, Mohammad. You and I could solve the problems here in 15 seconds. But the problem is that the country is not populated by Donniels and Mohammad. And we have to recognize, if we do not recognize the severity of the problem, all our solutions are going to be little band-aids, which are irrelevant. So Judaism is wonderful, Islam, everything, that's true. It could be. But right now, there is so much work that I could speak about in the Jewish community. There is so much work that needs to be done. And in Israel, the problem is that so-called many of the enlightened ones are outside of the Jewish conversation. So they're not fighting when they speak about, this whole theme tonight is Judaism and democracy, right? So for them, the issue is what's more important, is it Judaism or democracy? What about the core idea that Judaism, they're not two separate ideas? For most Jews outside of Israel, democracy is an inherent part of their Judaism. In Israel, it's a separate value. And then the question is, how do you compete? And if there's a competition, which one wins in which case? And then there's a zero-sum game. It's not a win-win. It's either or. They're different. They're not synergized. We have to recognize that for the first 72 years, or for the first 60 years or so of Israel, our primary challenge was, how do we make this a viable country? And part of what's happened is that we haven't yet shifted gears to recognize that we need to do some serious work not on declaring Jewishness and democracy. No, what is the Judaism that we care about? So I have half of Israel who doesn't want to engage in a reinterpretive process of Judaism and says, yeah, everybody agrees. Judaism and democracy are antithetical. One group says, that's why Judaism is not so important for me. And the other one says, oh, that's God's word. So now that's the toxic framework within which we're working. And some of the key allies that we need to create in order to restructure a Jewish conversation, an internal Jewish conversation, in which, again, as Yaniv stated, in which a Jewish state and a state of all of its citizens cannot be mutually exclusive. A state in which, Muhammad, you do not feel equally respected is, for me, not a Jewish state. But we're not there yet. We have to, it's going to take us another 50 years. We need an internal revolution in our Jewish discourse. And it's not going to happen, by the way, from parachuted down by politics. I want to tell you, if we've learned anything over the last number of years, is that the politicians are mirroring the tribal dimensions and the lowest discourse of our society. There's not going to be some, philosopher king parachuting and teaching enlightenment to Israeli society. We need to go deep into curriculum, into schools, and to re-engage with what is the Judaism that we want to have here.
But where I disagree with you, Donniel, is that this has to be, as you just stated, a Jewish discussion. And it will probably take 50 years, as you just said. Where does that leave me? I'm not part of the discussion. I'm not going to allow Jews to have this luxus, this pleasure of debating.
Muhammad, that's fair enough. But the reality is, there has to be two separate conversations. I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, but meanwhile, we have a hierarchy. And when we talk about equality, there's no equality. And if these are two separate discussions that are going to take 50 years, that means we're going to maintain the hierarchy for the next 50 years.
Not necessarily, because what happens is, if we look at the field, there is ideological transformation and transformation which grows out of self-interest. Some of the greatest progress in Jewish-Arab relations, again, with the Emirates, it's very similar. The fact is that in Israeli society, there's 20% of Israeli society, which is highly educated, remarkably loyal to the state of Israel, and basically untapped as an economic resource. There's a tremendous amount of interest in generating equality not in order to help you, but in order to help the Jews, in order to help Israel. Do you know how, if we could get Israeli Arab Palestinians and Haredim, close to 30% of Israeli society, to be fully economically involved, we have we have remarkable growth. And so there's a whole slew of Jewish organizations, Muhammad, who are out there pushing for equality, but they don't push for equality because they care about Muhammad Darawshe. They're pushing for equality because it's good for the Jews. So by the way, that's not bad. If at the end you get equality, it's not bad. So part of what happens, there's two forces, but I'm telling you, there's a deep work that's going to constantly harm you. When you or your kids are going to go to Tel Aviv University, are going to move into a neighborhood, someone's going to say, one second, do I want an Israeli Arab to be my neighbor? What do you mean they're paying their law? But what's happened? Every fact in the world speaks about how this, under the most impossible conditions, not the most, but very difficult conditions, Israeli Arab Palestinians have been remarkably loyal to the state of Israel. Remarkably loyal. Haven't created fifth columns during wars. Now, when is it that Israeli society is going to wake up? At the end of the day, we could push for various reasons and create a lot of progress. And I think there is progress that's taking place. There is progress over the last number of years. And a whole slew of NGOs are going to create. I remember you shared with me so many of the ideas that you've had over the years. The idea of making sure that in every Jewish school there will be an Arab teacher. It transforms things. There are things that will create room for improvement, changes. But I'm telling you that the larger transformation right now, Muhammad, I'm working. Do you have grandchildren yet?
Not yet.
Okay,
I have
I'm working.
my daughter just got engaged.
I'm working on Israel for my grandchildren and your kids. We're not. It's not, for me and you. It'll be okay. It's making some progress. It's getting there. We're creating greater economic equality, greater awareness of the phenomenal impact that you can have on the economy, just like the way the Arab population has had on medicine. Where would we be? Where would Israel's medical system be today if it wasn't for the remarkable and significant contribution of Israeli Arab Palestinians? So there's moves, but deep down, I want to tell you, building a country requires of us, and this was the punch in the gut, requires of you to recognize your weaknesses and your failures. And we have come home, but we haven't yet adapted our theological and moral tradition to fully take into account the responsibilities of power. And we assume, and I say this to Jews all the time, and they get very angry at me, but like, I don't care anymore. It's like, you know, when you're 62, you stop caring. I'm not trying. My mother loves me. I'm okay. I'm fine. You know, I'm confident. I have my job. My name is on my institute. I'm okay. I'm good. I'm like, I'm safe. If I can't talk, the reality is, I say to Jews, listen, like one of the famous statements in Israel, nobody will teach us morality. I say, why? What, because you died in the Holocaust? This victimhood is enabling us to stultify our responsibility to reinterpret our tradition. And so at the end of the day, we have to do multiple moves. We have to do moves of social cohesion. We have to conflict resolution, economic moves, any progress. But at the end, in the long run, monotheism is going to have to readapt if the Middle East is going to change. And until monotheism doesn't readapt, the Middle East, I'm telling you, will remain the same.
Okay, we're stopping this conversation for a second in order to bring in some questions. First question comes from Henry here, and whoever wants to ask questions, please write them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to express them. And Rabbi Hartman, you said something about the work that needs to be, educational work that needs to be done. And Henry is saying, yes, Palestinians and Israelis do not appreciate each other's narrative. The curriculum of both Palestinian and Israeli schools need to teach each other's narrative. He would like you to comment. I would also like you, Mohammad, to comment on this. When you look at both narratives in the schools in Israel.
Mohammad, you want to take it first?
Actually, I do know that there is a narrative that is being taught, but it's taught as the narrative of the other. It's not taught as a valid narrative, but it's taught as the lie of the others. The narrative of the other is seen as the lie that the others are trying to twist narrative. There's a lot of background noise, so those that have all, if you can mute.
Mute.
Coming from,
yep. No, everyone's on mute.
Yeah, that's better. I did study the Jewish and the Zionist narrative. Mark, I think it's from your side. You can be on mute. I keep getting a lot of background noise. Maybe it's my computer. Sorry about that. So I did study the Jewish and the Zionist narrative and the Israeli narrative, and I studied it, and I was taught this narrative to assume that it's also my narrative. As a kid, we were going through what's called the Israelization process. The state was trying to convince us that our narrative is wrong, and now we're supposed to adopt another new narrative, which is the Jewish Zionist narrative. And I must say that knowing a narrative is not enough. I know the Jewish narrative very well, and I also know about internal Jewish debate. about the creation of Israel, whether it is the historic debate or the current debate about the identity of the state and the identity of what should it be more religious or should it be more secular or should it be more nationalistic. I'm living the Israeli Jewish narrative day by day, but I must say that I can't reject it and I can't accept it at the same time, because every time I'm in dialogue with that narrative, I ask myself, where is my own narrative? Very often you learn about yourself by comparing yourself to others. It's not just dwelling in inside, in your own identity and in your own story that defines me. Also my relationship with others that defines me. I went to Muslim elementary school and I was taught to be good Muslim. I went to Catholic high school and they were trying to teach me to become a good Catholic. And when I went to Hebrew University and was getting doctrine in the political science department at the Hebrew University, the doctrine was the Jewish Zionist narrative. You know, Madaim Dina, the political science, it's what is right according to Jewish lens and not what is right according to global lens or Arab, Palestinian, or Muslim. But learning both the Christian and the Muslim and the Jewish narrative actually created two things for me. One is more comfort with my, I call it home identity, my home Muslim identity, my family identity, the identity of the immediate place that I live in. I feel very comfortable with my Islam, with my Arab identity, with my Islamic identity. And actually, I don't feel I need to defend it. Because maybe because I live in a safe home environment. If I live in a family of almost 5,000-6,000 family members, all in the same village, maybe that might around me gives me that kind of confidence. But the minute I walk out and I go to the nearby Jewish town, I feel an outsider that needs to try to find his place by assuming as that new space is a neutral space, but it's not. When I go to the nearby Jewish town, to Afula, I try to play the role that I am in neutral territory. I can be who I am and be with my own identity and narrative, and everyone else can be with their identity and narrative. It's not. This is fake. I'm faking it. The reality is that Afula is a Jewish town. It behaves as a Jewish town, and it takes a click for it to basically flip over my head, as it did in the past. I shared with Donniel in the past that during one day, a few years back, there was the terrorist attack on two teachers from that town. Ended up with pogroms against Arab shopkeepers in that town, including my father, who was hospitalized for about 4 days because he was beaten. And coming through that town a few times, pretending to look and act as a Jew, making sure I put the Hebrew newspaper on my dashboard to get away as a Jew and not give my identity because of fear, because of pure fear in certain moments. So learning the narrative does not give you immunity to feeling comfortable and feeling safe. Not enough. Good, it's important, and very often it's very handy, but it's as long as it's on shaky ground, it's not enough. Knowing the other is not enough. Even empathizing with the other is not enough. And I have a lot of empathy. I have a lot of liking to a lot of Jewish values and a lot of Jewish practices. And it's not just because I have Jewish friends, because I connect to them historically, because as I said earlier, I feel they are part of my Islamic extended identity. But still, I don't feel that gives me immunity when push comes to shove. And on the other end, I don't feel it grants me equality. and the discussion today is about Jewish inequality. So faking it to be very good in understanding Judaism and empathizing with it does not actually do the job.
If I could add to that, I've been involved in Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue for much of my life. Well, one of my graduate degrees is in Christianity. I did all my work and coursework for a PhD in Islam until my eyesight went on me and I couldn't continue. Part of what I learned is that most dialogue programs are a waste of time. Most sharing of narratives are a waste of time. The people who are willing to hear the other person's narrative right now are the people who are very rarely part of the problem. And they're the minority. Most dialogue programs are programs of the convinced dialoguing with the convinced. What we need to do, and I think one of the challenges of Israeli society, and this is just part of what, again, everybody knows what they know on the basis of their experiences, but I'm not claiming that which I know is true. I'm just telling that's just what I know. What is helpful is not dialoguing with the other and hearing their narrative. We're not even close to that. Who's reading each other's narrative? It's about engaging your own narrative in the presence of the other and allowing the other to be the critic and eyes on you as you're developing your own narrative. And then you can reach a point where you change your narrative to the extent that the other could exist. You're going to see the other not simply by reading their narrative, but by changing your own. I believe that societies grow, multicultural societies grow, when each group has the opportunity and the safety to redevelop its own narrative in the presence of the other. So that's just a slight addition on what Mohammad offered.
Just to add to this, Donniel, Henry is from Canada, and he says that he lives in a very diversified population, especially in urban countries. Yet, Canada, while it's a secular country, it is a Christian country, given the statutory holidays include Christmas and Easter. Jewish and Muslim holidays are identified, but not in regulatory sense. As a Jew in a minority situation, it doesn't bother me. Now, would that bother you?
Well, that's why I moved to Israel. I love being part of the majority.
So it would have bothered you.
I love being part of the majority. But for example, I do believe that Israel should be celebrating Jewish and Muslim holidays as national holidays.
Okay, but that's the point. Would that take away from its Jewish nature?
Again, for me, quite to the contrary, that would be an expression of its Jewish nature. See, part of what's happened is that we've created these false dichotomies and these notions about what the Jewishness of Israel means. Let me give you an example. When I lived in the United States, I was born in the United States, grew up in Canada and Montreal, then I made Aliyah when I was 13. And then after the first war in Lebanon, I had to get out of Israel and I lived in the United States for 11 years and then I came back. And I remember the shift that took place when I was there, how it moved from Merry Christmas to Happy Holidays. I remember how I felt when I'm watching the news and there isn't just a Christmas tree, there's also a menorah. Now, I was 2% of American society, a pishy 2%, nothing. And Christianity, and that's what Christianity contracted itself to make place for me. When they call America a Judeo-Christian country, what am I? I'm 2% of the country. And they said, you're here. I'm going to give you space. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But most significantly, during the period of Christmas, I was there. The country saw me. Now,
You're saying
Muslims are 20% of Israeli society, not 2%, 20%.
You're saying Christianity contracted itself to
Yes.
create space for you. Is
Jews have to contract themselves as part of the majority. 20% of Israeli society are Muslims, close to 20%. With 1% are Christian. We have to celebrate. I shouldn't go to work on your holidays. You have to, we nationally, and when nationally we celebrate your holidays, then you'll feel part of the story. You'll be seen. You're not hidden. You're not transparent.
By the way, if you do that, you'll enjoy a lot of great food. But let me go back to the
problem is that I don't eat wheat, and I don't. So like, there's a lot of stuff, So
I know you're hard guest to entertain.
I'm a very hard guest to entertain. It's like my wife is given no one likes to cook for me. I cook for myself now because no one even wants to get. It's just not worth it. I don't eat this. I don't eat that. Like 70 different.
That's why I told you once.
You got mangoes, I'm coming.
That's why I told you once. If you're not going to come and visit me in my house and eat, I will never visit you.
I can come, but like everybody thinks. I remember I once went to somebody's house. I was invited to this Reform synagogue in Chicago, as scholar in residence, and I came and I lectured, and the person asked me, here, welcome, Rabbi Hartman, come here. Well, they put me up in their home, and then he starts offering, what would you like to eat? I said, would you like salad? No, I can't have salad. Do you have a banana? He says, I have banana. So I ate a banana. What do you like? I like what? So I had banana and water. He was insulted the whole weekend. That's what I could eat. I was able to eat a banana. So it's and then took about 5 years for him to recognize my diet so he could overcome it. But those are some of the cultural things. But in reality, that's part of what we need to do. We have to reach a point where Jews, when I celebrate your holiday, see, you are like a diaspora Jew, Muhammad. You're a minority. You're a minority who says, I accept that there's a majority, and I'm going to be a loyal citizen, and I'm going to fight for equality. That's what when I see in you, I see diaspora Jews who are at home in America. They don't want to move anywhere else, and they're fighting for sense. They're not trying to change the country. They're not trying to say, okay, I want to be the majority. No, I want to fight for my place here. I see you. Part of what Jews have to do, Jews in America, in Israel, have to act like the majority in Western democracies act towards Jews. And that's part of what we have yet, that's the shift that needs to take place. And so here, if I love the fact, one of the fundamental principles of Judaism is what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That's the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. So if it's hateful for Jews to be transparentized, how can we transparentize you and call ourselves good Jews? We're violating the essence of our Torah when we do that.
But I want to go back to the term that you used, contraction, because I don't think Judaism, the way I know it in Israel, will contract. That's why I think that's why I think the dynamics might be the exact opposite dynamic. It's the expansion of Judaism to maturity, the maturity process that it has to go through to become a ruling majority and not a fighting minority or a surviving minority.
Contracting with someone. It's that process of maturity which says, what am I fighting about? I won. I have my country. I'm strong. I'm powerful. I'm successful. Making space for you what is it? What is it about? Why am I still threatened? It's part of that process is to contract, to welcome others, knowing fully well that you can do so. The great fight of Israel, we need a Jewish majority. We won that war. It's over. It's over. There is no democracy. So once that happens, now is the next stage, and we have to get to that next stage.
what will make that stage come fast?
See, again, I'm a one-trick.
You started by speaking about the need to.
I'm a one-trick pony. I have a methodology that I work on. I'm very happy that there's a lot of people who have different methodologies, because I would have never put all my money and all my efforts on one methodology. The methodology which I have adopted and which my institute adopts is, how do I create an internal conversation, principally, but not exclusively. Now we've started, as you know, with this program of Min HaBe'erot, in which Jewish and Muslim and Christian teachers and students are engaging in learning each other's cultures or teaching each other's cultures in the presence of the other. But my primary agenda is to take responsibility for Judaism's failures and to ensure that in Israel we produce the Torah that is worthy of the best of who we are, in which a Jewish majority takes responsibility for the fact that it is a majority, and, as you say, stops pretending as if it's a minority and gets itself a get out of jail card. My goal is, how do I create that internal renaissance within Judaism? How do I create rabbis and teachers and professors and books, lay leaders, army? How do I create an internal Jewish ideology that will see the Jewishness of Israel as enhanced by democracy and not threatened by it? That the Jewishness of Israel is enhanced by the fact that there's a 20% minority who are saying, I won the lottery. I get to live as a minority in a Jewish state. Because Judaism believes that all people are created in the image of God, and it doesn't only say that in Genesis 1, it actually has policies which implement that. My life's work is to try to, you never complete your task, is to move us forward on that task. Now, there are other people who pick other directions. Some people try to go from the top down through politics. Some are doing it by trying to activate Jewish self-interest by being aware of the economic power and gift of minorities. There's lots of methodologies. At the end, if all the methodologies coalesce, our job is to move forward. But the thing that I'm most concerned about is that we underestimate the severity of the problem, and as a result, we come up with infantilized solutions. It's just not the way to work. It's not, let's get a bunch of Jews, we'll get together, we'll eat hummus, and we'll just, we'll schmooze, it'll be nice. And once you see each other, I see you're human. It's how many
what
times
I call,
to make the
what
same
I call dialogue for the sake of dialogue.
It's just, we know, like it's there. The problems, we need sufficient solutions that seriously understand the severity of the problem. Otherwise, the solutions become dangerous because it takes people of goodwill. And here it is, I think I'm solving the problem, when in fact I'm not. I'm just plastering it with another Band-Aid, and there's cancers which are festering at the core. And unless we deal with them, we're just going to duplicate those problems. Now, we Jews are experts at demanding core work from the other. So when it comes to Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, we say, we want you to change your narratives. We want you to look at your textbooks. We want you to fully embrace me. It's only when you fully understand. We're experts at saying, we want the core work, but we're willing, but for ourselves, we don't have to sweat the work, because obviously we're not part of the problem. Well, Muhammad, in the Middle East is what it is because everybody's part of the problem.
Let's open up for other people to ask questions. Please feel free.
Or comments. They don't have to be questions only. Were we so convincing or confusing? Mark?
Yeah. Thank you for a very inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. I would just say that, at a certain point, I think you overrate the progress that's been made in other democracies. We are sometimes fortunate in that we have many different minorities, so there's not one minority who sticks out. And also, not in every case, but in many cases, in spite of horrible histories, which, as Donniel said, we like to put in the background. In spite of that, we don't have a single large minority, and we don't have unfinished business. We do have unfinished business, but not as much as Israel does, I think. So I think, I mean, if Mohammad and Donniel were made up the entire population, as you said, the problem would be solved in 15 minutes. But I think you set, Donniel, I think you set extraordinarily high standards for yourself. I mean, probably everyone in this country also believes, whether you're Welsh or Scots or whether you probably believe that you're chosen people. The English certainly do. But generally, we're quite happy for the English are quite happy for the Scots to think they're God's chosen people, in spite of wars in the past. So I think you set a remarkably high standard, but thank you for doing it. It's fascinating, but I think it's unfinished. It's the size of the minority and the unfinished business which causes the problem.
Take maybe 2-3 more comments or questions. I can call on people. Okay, Ron, you fell in at the trap. Ron Kutner.
Oh, gosh, there's so much to take in. So first of all, thank you very much for this, I don't know if inspiring or rather depressing evening. Looking at what's been going on lately in Israel, I'm not too optimistic about Judaism. It's all about power play. So being powerlessness is also other side of the same coin, being in the diaspora and feeling powerlessness. And yes, I think Rabbi Hartman is very much very right to say that we are just unable to deal with the power that we have in our hand. And I would say it's not just about being able to tell our narratives while taking into account the other, but really being able to see the interdependence that exists, that our narrative does not stand on its own without the other. So though she'll stand alone, as we know was the curse, the worst of all curse that we had with the Balaam curse at the time, and unfortunately we just unable to learn the story, learn the history, and learn the lesson, and it is frightening. It is frightening. So in the turmoil that we're in the last few months, left with questions and with awe rather than anything else.
I would just
Daniel, before you start answering, let me add one more question. I met your son, I met your daughter, but I was never introduced to them through you. I was introduced to them through work. We worked together on projects. But let's assume that I bring my kids who are their age for an encounter, and you try to explain to your kids the concept of equality to your kids. Which words would you use?
Which words would I use?
Yes, in the presence of my kids.
I'm talking to my children.
Yes.
I would use the language of my tradition. I would speak, and my children were raised on that. Like, for example, we have a blessing over the wine that we recite every Shabbat. And in that blessing, I raised it goes, part of the song is, Kivanu v'charta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim. Because it's part of it's every Jewish home around the world. States this term, because kiotanu, you have sanctified us, kiotanu kidashta, v'otanu birachta, and it shows us from amongst all the nations of the world. And my children, when they were very young, in my house we go, Kivanu v'charta v'otanu kidashta, la la lai 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 lai. We take out the words, mikol ha'amim, from amongst all the nations of the world. I believe that the Jewish people are chosen, but chosenness is not exclusive to Jews. I believe Christians are chosen. I believe Muslims are chosen. I've raised my children to understand that chosenness, that Jews were not chosen from amongst all the nations of the world. And they know that while the rest of the Jewish people say that we were chosen from amongst all the nations, my children were raised, la 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 la. We don't say those words. That was not part of my vocabulary. And so the principles, I raised them on principles in which it is self-evident to them as Jews that your children are equal. And that their belief in their chosenness, that one God could love more than one people. That's the insanity of monotheism, that there's one God who loves somebody best. I raised my children against that ideology, that the one God created the universe can contain multiple loves and multiple relationships. God could love Yishmael and Isaac, but in the Bible, that's not it. By the way, neither in the Quran or in the Torah, God has to love somebody best. That insanity has to come to an end. So my children are predisposed. Again, as I told you, our children, we could solve it. We just have, and by the way, we're not alone. And here, Ron, I want to tell you, I'm a little different. I don't get depressed. By the way, I never get depressed. It's just not in my DNA. It's a luxury that I can't afford. I don't get depressed. I get busy, like you. The truth is, you don't let yourself get too depressed either. Look what you do with your life. If you got so depressed, what you would be here? You would be working with Givat. You'd work? Where would you be? You'd go to Canada. You have plenty of options to be. We don't get depressed. I actually get much more excited by honesty. You know what depresses me? Bullshit. Excuse my French. When we just sort of miyafyef, we just sort of plaster over the problems and give false analysis. Let's talk about what the real problems are, and let's get to work. I am a member of a people who did the impossible. I am a member of people who should have never been here. We should have died a long time ago. Now, I'm a member of a people for whom impossible is not part of our discourse. So right now, what's impossible is not survival. Anti-Semitism doesn't scare me right now. Okay, there's some anti-Semitism, but it's nothing compared to the past. We now have a different challenge. And so that same energy and that same creativity which built this country now has to be directed to making this country, yes, Mark, a high standard. People say, you've set a high standard. Or they say, Donniel, you're naive. My response is thank you. That's what it means to be a Jew. That's what it means to be a Jew. You want to know the most naive verse in almost any religious tradition? Open up the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 2. Chapter 19, verse 1 says, and God spoke to Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them. Verse 2 says, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now look at this verse for a second. In a monotheistic tradition, that's an insane verse. No Muslim would ever say such a thing. If God is holy, then by definition, we're not holy. We don't have to be like God. If there is one God, creator of the universe, whatever I don't have to be that way. I'm a failure, original sin. Our tradition, what does it say? Both Christianity and Islam would never say this for two different reasons. Christianity would never say it because how could a human being be, with the exception of Jesus? be in any way associated with those standards. The whole redemption of Jesus is precisely such because of original sin, and the human beings are inherently corrupt. In Islam, no association between God and human beings is possible. That's the essence of heresy. Yet I was raised in a tradition in which God says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Really? The standard of the way I am supposed to live is the standard that God takes upon themselves, him or herself. Now, will I ever achieve it? Never. But the essence of a Jewish life is to always aspire. And what I want from Israel, I said this to Muhammad beforehand, what he wants because of his Israeli ideology, I want as a result of my Jewish ideology. We are together, but it is the type of Judishness that I want to have. In Israel, in which any human being doesn't feel respected, that is not the Judishness that I want. And of course, we're moving in a different direction. And of course, the tribalness of Israel is moving us in another way. Okay, we just have to be busy. We have to work hard.
I'll tell you why I'm depressed, or why it is that I'm confused, or I feel the sense of bankruptcy. For you, Judaism is ideology as a religious Jew. Me as a secular Jew, for me, Judaism is sociology. As from this perspective, I feel bankrupt with being able to defend my Judaism and say that Judaism can grow together with my democracy. Yaniv and I, we tend to tell Mohammad and others, we speak for the true Judaism. We are the true Zionists. We are the ones who really carry the values of Judaism into our democratic values. I'm not sure I can say that anymore from a sociological standpoint, looking at what's going on.
But here, Ram, one of my goals in life, not you per se or Yaniv, is I want to change Israeli conversation. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I believe that secular Judaism is as authentic as Orthodoxy. I believe conservative Reform Judaism is as authentic as Orthodoxy.
But they're out of defense. They're not accepted.
What I want you is, how do I create secular Israelis who have enough confidence to stop giving the mantle of Jewish authenticity to Orthodoxy? Fight for it. You gave it up. You have such inferiority complexes against Haredim. Get over it. Enough. You are authentic Jews. That's why I have a rabbinic school in which I am ordaining secular rabbis. I, an Orthodox Jew. I want to create secular rabbis. I want secular Israelis to get up. You remember the movie Network? I know I'm aging. I'm dating myself. But you remember that movie, that great scene where they open up the windows and they say, open up the window and shout outside, I'm angry and I've had it. I'm not going to take it anymore. Secular Israelis have to stop seeing themselves as outside of the Jewish conversation. Most secular Israelis live vital Jewish lives. They celebrate the calendar. They're engaging now in more and more Jewish education, but you don't see yourself as empowered. You don't see yourself as a player. You define yourself as sociological spectators. If secular Israelis make up 30, 35, 40% of Israeli society, and they begin to see themselves as empowered, dignified Jews, not I'm secular but, no buts. I am secular, and that represents the best voice of Judaism as I understand it. And fight for that. Look at the insanity of Israel. Why do you accept the fact that there's a rabbinate in Israel? The chief rabbi of Israel, is that your rabbi? Yet you don't vote for that. You don't care. You vote principally on foreign policy and allow and say, you know what? Whenever it comes to Judaism, that's the business of the Orthodox. If that'll change, that'll be an integral part of the type of Jewish conversation trend changing. And the allies that I'm looking for, there are a lot of liberal Orthodox Jews in Israel. There's also a lot of liberal Masorati. There's a lot of interesting moves here. We need to create a coalition together with secular Israelis, but secular Israelis, you know who their real coalition with? We saw this in the Kotel deal, and this is a whole other conversation. Who is the real partner of the secular Israeli? The ultra-Orthodox. Because here along comes Naftali Bennett, an Orthodox Jew. He comes along and says, we have to create a kotel for liberal Judaism. He, an Orthodox Jew, is committed to religious pluralism. Netanyahu goes along. For whatever reason, and it's complicated, the ultra-Orthodox say no. Where were the secular Israelis? Silent. Were they fighting? They said, what do I care? The ultra-Orthodox say the Kotel belongs to me. The secular Israeli says the Kotel belongs to you. Okay, great, let's work together. When that changes, we could create a revolution. And part of what we've learned is you don't need a majority of Israel to change Israeli society. The ultra-Orthodox are able to define a conversation by being 10%. We need 10, 15%, 20% who say on a whole slew of moral, spiritual issues of state and religion, but today our conversation is the status and rights and relationship with non-Jews in Israeli society, who get up and say, Israel is not a Jewish state if Muhammad and Muhammad's children do not feel at home here. That's not what I came home as a Jew. That's not a Jewish state. And when you and Yaniv and all of us together, we join together, and we don't say, I'm not saying it is an Israeli, and it's not, this is Judaism, that is an aberration. That's what Reform and conservative Judaism outside of Israel got up and said, I'm willing to create an alternate language of what Judaism is about. Secular Zionism started that conversation, but it stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
For the last 67 years, it hasn't been engaged in interpreting. And that's why it doesn't have its own rabbis. I'm trying to change that. That's why in Orthodox schools, the country gives you 10 to 15 hours of state-funded education, Jewish education. How many hours does a secular school get funded? Zilcho. Nothing. Why? Because secular parents don't say, I have a Jewish education and my philosophy. Every Orthodox school has a funded rabbi. Why don't secular schools have secular rabbis in their schools funded by the country? There's a revolution waiting to happen, but we have to understand the depth of the problem. We have to create coalitions, and this is going to take time. It is. And we know that, and that's why I know, Mohammad, we speak about that it's a conversation between Jews and Arabs. But there is also there's a coalition that needs to be built so that you could feel at home here. And that coalition has to, you need more Jewish partners who are willing to look at you and to see you and to recognize that your status and your rights are inherent to what a Jewishness of Israel needs to be. We need to build that coalition. And some of that will happen together, but a lot of that is going to have to happen internal to the Jewish community, which is just going to have to change. And yes, that's a high standard, but we're supposed to be holy because God's holy. So Ya'alev Yavo, let's get busy.
Okay, because we are very limited with time, I'm going to just maybe make a
I'm sorry, I
get
this is one of those I get like really, it's like, I gotta tell you, I've had it.
This is why we brought you.
You're my partners, and what happens? I'm saying, it's like enough. It's like enough. It's like, so we could change this, by the way.
So, Mohammad, maybe you say some of your closing remarks, and then I would like to bring my remarks as a final remarks here. Okay.
Just a quick sentence. We will not give up the fight. The question is, will we do it on behalf of our Jewish values? We'll do it on behalf of our humanistic values, universalistic values, not necessarily the Jewish values. This will hurt you because where you come from, it's not true, but this is where we come from.
Okay. So just 2 minutes, I will say that, I appreciate the need for the Jewish discourse. But at the same time, I must say that I'm not going to be in a waiting mood. Learning from the experience of the Jews, as Donniel said, in the diaspora, we need to go into the search for becoming a minority, comprehending the status of a minority, which one works on its crystallizing its own unique identity. So yes, we are Palestinian and we are Arab, but we're also Israeli. The question is, what does this combination mean? What does it mean culturally? Maybe I've traveled in this path more than the average person in Israel, but it's a journey that many generations, especially younger people, need to start it at a very young age. They need to engage in this discourse, not for the sake of narrative debate. And I agree with you, Donniel. I think narrative debate is just waste of time. But for the sake of self-reflection, so I can understand, deepen my understanding of your narrative, so I can crystallize not only my historic narrative, but I can start crystallizing my future narrative. I need to be able to come as a capable partner for dialogue in the formulation of the future Israeli identity. I don't want Jews only to decide what future Israeli identity. Meanwhile, this can be done, as we discussed earlier, and you also agreed on, by creating success stories, by creating, that capacity of the Arab community of being in relationship and in partnership with Jews, where that partnership counts, such as in the medical industry today, such as in the high-tech industry today. That partnership, because it requires a great deal of brain power, a great deal of intellect, a great deal of human value, of individual value. If the Arab community builds its capacity there, then it will not allow the Jewish population to look down at Arab citizens, but will look at more as maybe peers working on the same level, bringing in the cultural and moral capacity side to side to the professional capacities that are the common denominator for both sides. So I do appreciate, and I think that it is right and correct for the Jewish discourse to evolve and maybe retract a bit to create space for Israelis, because right now it's trying to take over Israelis. And the nation state law is maybe a good example where Jewishness is trying to take over Israeliness. Maybe it needs to retract to the true size of Jewishness in Israel, which is 79%, 78% of the size, allowing the 21% also crystallize, but not to crystallize in the separate track, but in a way to crystallize so that we can connect the two connections together, mainly initially on mutual interest, but ultimately maybe this can evolve also on mutual moral values for the.
Okay,
Thank you for coming, Donniel. It's always great to not finish a discussion with you.
And thank you, Mohammad. So some of my remarks here, I would like to go to the beginning of this discussion with Donniel. Was very interesting when you spoke about the chosen people. In the beginning, I wrote a comment to myself, Mikol Amin, who's chosen? Chosen from whom? And with a question mark about this and racism. And then I heard you answer Muhammad about Nutanu Bakhata la 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 la. And of course, I was very happy to hear it, also inspired. But I want to tell you, I don't know too many Jewish people, religious Jewish people, that will say, Nutanu Bakhata la 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 la. The notion of Utanu Bacharta, we are the chosen people from others, already creates a letter of those who are better or classified and those who are not. And this is a main issue here in Israel. And when you look back 3 years ago, we were involved already then in two major issues in Israel, which were not pure politics. It was about the essence of the country. One, and they were both connected. One was the debate about the national state law that was already very heated then, with a vast majority of Jewish Knesset members that were supportive of it. And the second was about the curriculum for civic education in Israel. And they're really connected. Bennett, as a minister of education, had changed the curriculum for teaching civics in Israel in a way that it was very much connected to the philosophy of the nation-state law. Israel is the state of its Jews who own the state, and this is what we teach our children. And there was a change in the curriculum, and there was a big public discourse over this. And it is connected to the question that you then forward to Juan afterwards about the discourse of ownership of Judaism. Those who care about Judaism, most of them see themselves as chosen by God over the Arabs. We are here because we were chosen, and this is our land. We were chosen to own this land, and we are the owners of the land. Those who see Israel different are not engaged in the Jewish discourse. They're looking for other values for that. That's a catastrophe for Judaism, because it means that we do not connect the dots. But it's also a catastrophe for Israel, because while we are in such a situation, we're engaged in a decision-making process that is based on a wrong concept of Israel, which is not based on equality. And that concept is what leads our politics. And the nation-state law is not another law. For me as a citizen of the state, it is a basic state law that confronts me with my basic ideals as a humanist. It is asking myself, am I part of a racist situation where me and Muhammad are not equal as partners in this state? And I'm just not willing to be classified as such in Israel. So we do have a very big problem that we need to tackle both bottom up and top down. When we think about bottom up education, one thing that I didn't accept from your remarks, Donniel, was looking at dialogue programs as a waste of time. Because part of our problem is the ignorance. We live next to each other, we're totally ignorant of the others. The Jewish people that are growing here, K through 12, 90% of them would not even meet once an Arab, and vice versa. We become prejudiced, we become racist. This is very dangerous. This is a fertile ground for racism. In order to tackle that, everything is valid. So dialogue programs by itself will not solve the problem, but they are part of what we need to create as a new ground to recognize how Israel is, the fabric of Israel is a state of people that are different and have ownership together of our state. We cannot underestimate it. And let me tell you something really bothering. I've been trying for the last 8 years to reach out to the Jewish Religious Orthodox Society to be part of the Givat Haviva dialogue programs. Totally not successful. We don't even have one Orthodox school that is willing to be engaged in a dialogue with an Arab school. That's a problem. We do have Arab, very religious schools that do want to be engaged with the Jewish population in a dialogue. So from my point of view, the question of how do we educate different is critical to create an opportunity to live in a country where Judaism, Jewish values and equality do not contradict. And when I sum all this with the question of chosen people, I love the way you describe chosen. But I think we're in together in the changing of the discourse for the secular people like myself to be liked to see themselves as chosen Jews. They're not Jews by mistake. They had chosen to become part of Jewish peoplehood. And Jewishness means something to them. that they need to take ownership in order to not let Judaism become racist towards other people. This is anti-Jewish. From my point of view, this is also anti-Zionism. But that's not the case for the discussion we have today. And when I take all this back to the question of how do we live together, for me, the shared society that is a home for the 100% of all its citizens, that all value Israel as their shared home based on equality. We all have ownership of this home, is the only way to live here as a Jew. Because otherwise, being a Jew in Israel contradicts my humanist values. And I do not see, Ron, any contradiction between Jewish values and humanist moral values. For me, they go alone. I don't see them separately. It's all connected to one tree, to the roots of who I am as a human being. So to sum up this discussion, as a state, we have walked backwards. And the nation-state law and what's happening in our educational system shows this. As people that are engaged in the creation of a shared society, we should realize that this is a basic necessity for us to change in order to achieve the shared society. There is no sharing of unequal status of citizenship. And therefore, this is a huge task for all of us. And having said that, I would like to thank again Mohammad and Donniel for an inspiring talk, and thank all of you for joining with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very
Thank
much.
you, Donniel. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. You can all unmute yourself saying bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for letting me participate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you ever solve the problem, you can teach the rest of the world a great deal.
Thank you, Mark Moody Stewart. Okay, I'm closing the discussion, guys. Have a good night. Or good afternoon.
Very interesting discussion and debate and presentation. And yeah, I learned a lot again. I have also to contract a bit to the way contraction that reminds me to the Tsum Tsum, but also living as a Jew in a minority world in the Netherlands. We lived so long in a minority world. Now Jews in Israel are a majority. They have to grow up sufficiently to contract themselves also a bit, and that's the difficulty. You need growth, sufficient growth to contract, and there we have to work on.
Yeah. So thank you, Paul. By the way, say hello to Vered when you see her next time.
Sorry, what did you say?
Hello to Vered from my family.
Yeah.
When you see her the next time you see her.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, take care.
Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Bye bye. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Darawshe?